The night was cold, damp, and endless. In the silence of a medieval prison, a single cry could echo like thunder, reaching ears that had long since forgotten what mercy sounded like. Imagine a woman, her wrists chained to stone, her body trembling, not from the weather but from the weight of her fate. These were not merely punishments. They were designed spectacles of terror, crafted to strip a person not only of freedom but of dignity, voice, and humanity. Today, I want to take you deep into the shadows of history, where the walls whisper of suffering that has long been silenced, the terrifying punishments inflicted upon women in medieval prisons. To understand these punishments, we must first understand the stage on which they were performed. The medieval prison was not a place of reform. It was a dungeon of despair, where survival itself was a crime against expectation. In Rome, in the streets of England, across the cold stone castles of Europe, women who entered these chambers did not step into a system of justice, they stepped into a theater of cruelty. What makes it even more terrifying is not just what happened inside, but why. For women, imprisonment was rarely about crimes committed. Often, it was about defiance, about stepping out of line, about daring to challenge the roles the world demanded of them. Their punishments were not equal to men's. They were often far more degrading, aimed at breaking not just the body, but the very spirit of womanhood. One of the most chilling punishments was the scold's bridle, sometimes called the brank. It looked like an iron cage, heavy and cold, locked onto a woman's head. A sharp piece of metal pressed against her tongue, sometimes piercing it, making speech impossible. This was reserved for women accused of gossiping, nagging, or speaking against men in power. Think about that for a moment. Words, mere words, treated as crimes worthy of mutilation. The cruel design turned her into a public spectacle, paraded through streets while crowds laughed and mocked. Her dignity, her voice, her most basic human tools were stolen in plain sight. And the worst part, many women subjected to this punishment were mothers, wives, daughters, whose only crime was refusing to remain silent. Then there was the ducking stool, a wooden contraption designed to humiliate and torture under the guise of community justice. A woman was strapped into a chair, tied tightly, and then plunged repeatedly into rivers or ponds. Onlookers gathered as though it were entertainment. They would jeer as she gasped for air, each plunge dragging her closer to drowning. Her lungs filled with water, her body convulsed with terror. But this was not about testing guilt or innocence. It was about control, about making an example. They called it punishment for witches, scolds, or unfaithful wives. But what it really was a ritual of domination, where the crowd became complicit in the cruelty, swept up in the ecstasy of violence. In the suffocating darkness of the dungeon itself, punishments grew even more intimate, more personal, and more terrifying. The manacles and strappado were often reserved for women accused of treason or witchcraft. Imagine being suspended by the wrists, twisted behind the back, the entire body's weight dragging against dislocated shoulders until the sockets tore apart. For women, there was no mercy in these chambers. Many of them screamed until their voices broke, until silence became their only companion. These methods were not about extracting truth, but about planting fear so deeply into society that no woman would dare question her place again. Even hunger itself became a weapon. Women were often placed in what was known as the oubliette, a pit so dark and narrow it was designed for one purpose, only to be forgotten. The very word comes from to forget. Here, women were dropped and left, sometimes for days, sometimes forever, with no food, no water, no contact. They sat in their own filth, clawing at stone walls that never yielded. Slowly, they faded, starved, and disappeared into memory. Their existence erased, not just by death, but by deliberate neglect. What strikes hardest is that many who suffered this fate were not criminals at all, but victims of politics, of family feuds, of accusations whispered by men who needed them silenced, and then, the body itself was weaponized against them. In some prisons, women accused of infidelity or witchcraft were stripped, shaved, and paraded before townsfolk. This act, deceptively simple, was devastating. A woman's hair in many medieval cultures was a symbol of honor, femininity, and dignity. To strip it away was to declare her unclean, unworthy, less than human. Children watched as their mothers were degraded. Husbands turned away in shame or satisfaction. And the women themselves, once pillars of their families, were reduced to symbols of disgrace. This punishment left no scar the eye could see, but the wounds it carved were eternal. But perhaps the most terrifying were the devices of shame and violation, those designed to humiliate rather than kill. The chastity belt is often spoken of in myths and exaggerations, but records do tell us of belts and girdles locked onto women, not for protection, but for punishment. To live bound by iron, denied even the most basic freedoms of bodily dignity, was a punishment that did not end when the crowd dispersed. It was a private hell, carried day after day, a reminder that her body did not belong to her. It belonged to the men who controlled the key. And hovering always was the accusation of witchcraft, a death sentence dressed as justice. Women who spoke too boldly, who healed with herbs, who dreamed beyond their station, found themselves tied to stakes or pressed with stones, their very lives extinguished under the banner of righteousness. These punishments, brutal as they were, carried one unspoken message: that a woman's value could be destroyed the moment she refused to bend. Yet within these stories of cruelty, there is another story, a quieter one of resistance, of dignity that could not be extinguished. Many women, even as they faced unspeakable torture, held on to their voices until the last possible breath. They sang hymns while chained, whispered prayers through swollen tongues, and passed down their stories in fragments so that centuries later we might remember. Their courage, though buried under layers of stone and silence, still beats like a faint drum in the dark corridors of history. When we hear these stories today, we are not just listening to history. We are hearing echoes of our own time, of voices still silenced, of bodies still controlled, of dignity still denied. Medieval prisons may have crumbled, their chains rusted away, but the legacy of cruelty, the attempt to use punishment as domination, still lingers. And perhaps that is why we must remember these terrifying punishments, not to revel in horror, but to honor those who endured, and to remind ourselves that justice without dignity is nothing more than cruelty dressed in law. This is only the beginning of the story. The dungeons still hold secrets, and the voices of women who once suffered there have more to tell. Their punishments were not just 7 acts of terror. They were 7 mirrors reflecting the fears, the hatreds, and the power struggles of an entire age. And to truly understand their legacy, we must step even deeper into the shadows of those prisons, into the cries that history tried to bury. The dungeon doors were never meant to close quietly. They slammed, echoing through stone corridors like a death knell. A sound designed to remind both the prisoner and the keeper that mercy did not belong in such places. For women, these prisons became laboratories of cruelty. Each punishment an experiment in how far human dignity could be stretched before it shattered. But what truly terrifies us today is not only the physical suffering, it is the cold intention behind it. These punishments were not accidents of history. They were deliberate instruments, shaped by a society that feared the strength of a woman's voice, her independence, her resistance. Take, for example, the whipping post, where women accused of petty theft or moral offenses were tied and stripped bare before entire towns. The whip cut deep into flesh, but the punishment was not meant to kill, it was meant to mark. The scars were permanent reminders, carried on the skin like inscriptions of shame. Imagine a young woman, trembling as the leather tore her back, knowing that long after the pain faded, the whispers would never stop. Mothers who tried to shield their children from hunger by stealing bread found themselves condemned not only by law but by the eyes of their neighbors. In these moments, the community itself became a weapon, enforcing a system that demanded obedience at the cost of dignity. Worse still were the pillories and stocks, devices of restraint that transformed punishment into entertainment. Women were locked in place, hands and head protruding, exposed to ridicule, to the spitting and jeering of crowds. Rotten food was hurled, mud smeared across their faces, stones thrown at bruised skin. For hours, sometimes days, they endured this public humiliation. And though no chains pierced their flesh, the bonds that held them were stronger than iron, the chains of shame. Many collapsed not from exhaustion but from despair, realizing that their punishment would outlive the sentence. Their names, their reputations, their very identities were erased and rewritten by the cruelty of public scorn. But among the most chilling punishments was the torture of water and fire. Inquisition chambers, often cloaked in secrecy, wielded these elements with devastating precision. Women accused of witchcraft were forced to undergo ordeals thrown into rivers with hands bound. If they sank and drowned, they were declared innocent. If they floated, it meant the devil held them up, and they were guilty. This grotesque paradox left no room for survival. Fire, too, became a weapon of judgment. Women were burned at stakes, flames consuming them as the crowd watched in solemn silence or eager fascination. For some, death came quickly. For others, it lingered, the smoke choking their lungs long before the fire touched their skin. These were not punishments. They were executions staged as moral theater, a warning to all who might dare to defy. Inside the walls, cruelty sometimes took quieter forms, but no less terrifying. The Iron Maiden, though debated by historians, has lingered in memory as a symbol of the macabre. A coffin-like device lined with spikes, it was said to close slowly, pressing points into the flesh without immediately killing. Whether myth or reality, its terror lay in the imagination it stirred. For women, the threat alone was often enough. Rumors spread quickly, and fear itself became a form of control. In this sense, medieval prisons punished not just bodies but minds. To live each day under the shadow of what could happen was a torment all its own.